Good afternoon, and on behalf of ASCEND and the Center on Global Brand Leadership at Columbia Business School, I want to welcome you to our conversation on HR and its role in leadership transformation. The last 2 years have seen unprecedented pressure on American business, not just in responding to an extraordinarily volatile economic environment, but also in rethinking corporate values in an era of shifting obligations and expectations. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and the pandemic, public expectations of corporate values have shifted. According to a recent Morning Consult poll, the public now perceives a company's primary obligations as being to first its employees, secondly its customers, third to communities, placing shareholders near the bottom of the list. It's really quite a significant shift in expectations. It is no small matter to help companies rethink values and strategies in a time of change. As a result, expectations have risen for HR teams to step up and help companies build strong organizational cultures and new performance environments. It's a critical challenge. Fortunately, we have three exceptional panelists to help us understand this changing environment and the emerging innovations in human capital management. Yvette Burton is the lead faculty and designer of NYU's School of Professional Studies Human Capital Management Program, as well as a Business Learning Solutions architect at the university. Previously, she was vice president of Workforce Solutions and Intelligence at Lockheed Martin. Kraig Eaton is a principal in the U.S. Human Service area at Deloitte and an expert in HR transformation and operational excellence. And Ingrid Olsen is the chief people officer of Inovalon and a global expert in helping technology companies to transform their businesses and HR strategies. And joining me in moderating this event is Matthew Quint, director of the Center on Global Brand Leadership. During this event, we will want your questions starting right now. The Q&A function of Zoom is live, so please enter your questions and we will try to get to as many of them as time permits. Kraig, let me start with you. Since you wrote Deloitte's sort of thought leadership overview of trends in HR for 2021. I'm not sure when you were writing that and doing your work on that, you could have imagined all the things going on, but tell us, why don't you start with this? What are the expectations, the major trends for HR to step up in this type of change?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ken. So just quickly to answer your first question, we did actually author this report, which we call our Deloitte Human Capital Trends, which we're in our 11th year. But we did a survey. All of our trends are backed by a survey. And we did our survey in the August-September timeframe. So really I think in the thick of the pandemic. And so what did we see? Maybe I'll start with the positive. In comparison to the trends report we launched the year before, the confidence in HR increased. And it increased significantly, both through the lens of HR executives, where they stated that they were twice as confident within the role of HR in helping navigate the organization through disruption, as well as twice as confident through the lens of the business executives, whose lack of confidence in the function decreased by 50%. But interestingly enough, when we asked them what drove that increase in confidence, obviously this massive shift of protecting the health and safety of the workforce and helping to make this pivot into working in a virtual environment was key. But if you think about both of those are really the edict of the HR organization. It's part of their mission already. What they're really looking for HR to do in terms of stepping up, as you asked, Ken, is to really help the broader enterprise develop the next generation of leaders. Think about what the workplace of the future looks like. We've had a lot of leaders say, gosh, we're going to go through this unprecedented disruption. We really don't want to go back to the way it was. We would actually want to use this disruption as a catalyst for change and rethinking how the work gets done, the workplace in which we do that work, and even the workforce that delivers that work. And HR needs to support the entire organization across all three of those dynamics.
So thank you, Kraig. Yvette, so Kraig just described actually sort of, you might think sort of a historic expansion in the mission of HR and expectations. So a demand from leadership that HR step up Using those words, I stole it from you guys. But are HR departments ready for that change? And what have you seen as happening in the last year or two as increased in terms of increased demands on that function?
Yeah, Ken, thank you for the question. And I was just shaking my head vigorously as Kraig was talking. Prior to COVID, if you can remember that far back, there was this future of work, and that seemed lofty, theoretical, way out there. And I remember HR professionals chuckling to themselves and saying, we can't even get an enterprise resource product in. We don't have a budget. And now the conversations of, among the practitioners that I speak with are, be mindful what you ask for, because now, they were saying, put me in coach, and now they're up at bat. And as you could imagine, there are some leaders that, have been integrated into their business's core. They've had a seat at the table. They've made a real contribution to top and bottom line. And those practitioners are getting to live the agility that they've worked for. They've got a resource view on the careabouts of the enterprise, and they're also externally focused, and they balance those insights and bring them to bear for the leaders to make real choices. And then you could imagine, the other organizations that have considered competencies in their HR function, like D&I, they've been places where people have gone to retire, take a break from the road. They, are just involved in maybe compliance activities, and now they're being reminded that now more than any time during their working lifetime, that, how is it that these ways are relevant to the top and bottom line, and what do we need to look at, not just with regards to staying out of court, but having the home court advantage in the markets that we play in. So I think it's a really interesting time, and a time for, put up, I interpret that as skill up, which is what I hear a lot of professionals focusing on.
Thank you, Yvette. So Ingrid, you're the chief people officer of a major technology company at Novolon. I often think of technology as sort of being a cultural trendsetter in some ways, or a business trendsetter. What do you see from inside a tech company, and what do you think it says about sort of the trends at broader scope for HR?
So technology is a great place to practice some of the things that both Kraig and Yvette spoke to, which is HR as an underutilized lever for the company to differentiate itself and become more competitive in the space of talent. Because for the technology companies, talent is, the thing that your competitiveness pivots around talent. And so everyone has access to eventually the same natural resources, the same IP, etc. But talent is the key differentiator, and it's scarce in technology. So technology is where everyone wants to be, and there's scarce talent. And so there's, it's been frequently referred to as the war for talent, and that is real in technology, right? And you are always trying to differentiate yourself as an employer to attract talent. And actually, as Kraig was referring to, what happened in the past year and what are the expectations of HR to be able to, help people shift to work from home and help people through a pandemic, that was actually another opportunity for HR to differentiate yourselves as an employer, because how you treated people in that period, how you avoided layoffs or extended additional benefits or reached out to people who were bereaved. Every detail of that was an opportunity to differentiate yourself and show yourself as someone who is pro-talent. So technology companies are, I've been in technology companies my entire career, and at least for the past decade plus, I've been working specifically around talent as a strategic lever for the company and around DE&I. So first in Europe, where the key thing is around gender, and here it's much more nuanced. And this past year was just a phenomenal opportunity to gain momentum. So technology, I would say, whatever technology company you're in, there's a war for talent. Technology companies are not all born equal. So some have very, very conservative looking leadership teams, and others are very progressive. Now, I have maybe tended to exercise my craft mostly in the more conservative side. And there is a rich opportunity in those companies, A, to bring HR to bear as a differentiator, B, to help them avail themselves ever better of diverse talent as well as of internal talent. So those are some of the things that I would say are what goes on in technology companies around the HR topic at the moment.
So let me follow up. So in the fight for talent, which you described as being sort of the driver of technology companies, sort of human capital strategy, if you asked me to sort of have this conversation 5 years ago, I would have said that would about attracting talent is all about what's the next unicorn company, what's going to turn into the next billion, trillion, whatever set of zeros you want. Is that changed so that people are thinking more about the culture of the companies they're being attracted into? Is it a more complex matrix that talent is thinking about these things?
For sure, the opportunity to be part of the next great tech adventure is still something that really is something you sell to candidates. And I'm really fortunate to be in a space where we're at the intersection of healthcare and technology, which is one of the maybe the latest and greatest frontiers of technology. But for sure, versus what people were asking me, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe even 2 years ago, there's an incredible shift in people's focus on what is the culture, what do you do on D&I, are you a responsible company socially, what sorts of things that, talent at all levels are asking us. What do you, what is your community outreach? What organizations do you support? And culture questions, really, really big. Even the senior candidates who maybe have been in career tracks for years are coming to me going, I really want to understand how the culture works at Innova before I join. It's become a much larger topic than it ever was from my perspective.
So Kraig, let me bring you back into the conversation. There's an article in the Washington Post, I think yesterday, that basically sort of pushed on the notion that companies are acting differently today. They went and looked at sort of some of the biggest companies in the country and said, hey, a lot of them are making money even in the pandemic and still laying off people. And they sort of, the suggestion was that some of the sort of promises were more empty than about sort of culture change were empty. That was at least the suggestion of the article. Get into the sort of the details of it, but let me ask you that. I mean, sort of from your perch where you see lots of different companies, is culture change real in this environment? Is the morning consult poll, which I started with, where suggesting companies should be thinking about employees before shareholders. Is that a real change? I would love to get your reaction to that question, and then see Yvette nodding as well. So I want to hear from her as well.
I'm sure Yvette, Ingrid, and I all have an opinion on this. My perspective is it's real, but it's early days, and there's a real difference between making statements out in the media and making commitments versus actually following through and being bold on those commitments. And so a good example on the back of the Black Lives Matter movement and push for social equality, you see a lot of organizations taking bold steps around diversity, equity, inclusion, and being very transparent around their numbers and the metrics with respect to the diversity within their organization. I think for many individuals, they would look at that and say, that's step one, maybe step half. What we really want to do is we want to see a greater level of commitment. I'll give you an example. We want you to completely redesign your recruiting process and think about how you can remove unconscious bias from the process. Why do you ask candidates about their zip code or home address? is that in many of us, our view is that that's embedding unconscious bias, or asking as part of the performance management process, would you work with this individual in the future? That opens up too much opportunity for unconscious bias. So organizations need to move beyond just transparency and move into greater steps and greater elements of action. Publishing what percentage of your leadership is underrepresented minorities, in our opinion, is not enough. How influential are those leadership roles? And of those most influential roles, what's your URM population there? So I think the workforce and society as a whole are optimistic but cautious.
Yvette?
I would agree, and I think that I would just add sustainable, large-scale change. And you can see which companies have the muscle memory to be able to turn that up, or to arrive in the moment in a way that's authentic to the markets they serve and the industries they're in and the people in the organization. And then I've seen early stubbing of the toe of companies that think that they only have to issue out a few well-placed checks at historically Black colleges, and that'll give them enough brand cover. And in previous, previous interpreted as cancel culture waves, that may have sustained. But I think that I have companies that are revamping every piece of literature in the organization for language and terms. I work with a telecommunications company that used to have their cable trucks deliver in Harlem, and because they were, uptown, they had this tense relationship with the communities there. They always had, as part of their corporate social responsibility, well, let's give a few jobs in the summer, workshops. Well, they now up the level of the person that reports to the board, not only on corporate social responsibility, but on D&I. And the repositioning of that role, that same effort that they launched last year, this year they're going deeper and saying, teaching kids up in Harlem these jobs as laborers makes us look good. It's not sustainable. What about urban architecture? So now, part of a green effort, they looked at big data, looked at how many of their workers and geographies had high illness rates in school because of the particles coming from the truck. And so green architecture catches those particles and improves the health of the community. Big data, those types of structural changes in organizations are the types of needle-moving culture shifts that I'm seeing.
So,
and I just thought, again, Ken, if I can jump in, because I think sort of following right up on that, and Ingrid may have a thought too, which is the needle moving, I think, is a big issue, right? Which is how do you demonstrate it? It's one thing within an organization where you do it, but obviously in the socio-political activist world, there's a sense of how well is that needle moving at large in the world, and how do we track that? And then what are the expectations of the pace of that needle moving? This has been an issue since the founding of our country, essentially. It's moved very slowly. How do you balance that expectation on the needle just zipping all of a sudden, which we know is going to be not viable, and yet there's a urge for that right now to do that? Wonder any of your thoughts, any of the three of you thoughts on that?
I'll just add very quickly, you're 100% right. I mean, I've been on calls where they're having a sense of urgency around this, and I've seen other traditionally underrepresented people around the table when the meeting's about to end and somebody says, okay, let's table this to our next quarterly meeting. If you're starving, or if you can't breathe, that seems incredibly like a place of privilege. You can defer some of this stuff. So you're absolutely right in that there's freedom is intoxicating, and there's a sense of urgency around stepping off air hoses, to go too far with a metaphor.
No, it's a good metaphor. Can I ask you, Ingrid, I mean, if you want to pick up on that as well, but I also want to ask you about some of the specific, and there are questions about this, so I actually want to, for the audience, I want to sort of pick up on that as well. Kraig and I think Yvette both talked about sort of how to change in actually hiring practices to make sure that they are fair and equitable. Can you sort of talk about, and I think that's the interest of some folks in the audience, but there's also a question for the audience about sort of not just hiring, but firing practices as well. Are there changing best practices to ensure that perhaps firings are inevitable in an economy? Assuming that they are there changes in how companies engage with employees, are fair in their practices, give them time, and what do you think sort of the trends are in that area?
Are you asking me? Sorry.
Yes, I am.
Okay, so there were several questions in there. All of them. Anxious to speak to all of them. So let's start in reverse chronological order, perhaps. So I would say that inherently, unfortunately, both hiring and firing, when we look at data, which, as you know, is one of the things that I argue strongly for, is that if we're not data literate, if we're not measuring this stuff, if we don't understand how to slice and dice data and follow through on trends, we don't know if the needle is moving. So that is the first place, right? But inherently, my observation is that hiring and firing practices, bias is built in. Like whether we do it consciously or not, bias is built in. And we have to revamp not only the processes, but in fact, I had this debate with our DE&I team the other day, and they drew my attention to it very clearly. The hiring practice and the revamping of that process it's actually towards the end goal. The start of it is educating and getting the incumbent, this is my words now, the incumbent power to the table, right? And interested and understanding why it's to their benefit to be part of making it more equitable. Because otherwise you can revamp your processes all day long and you'll get the same result. You'll get the same outcome because the bias is still there. So you've got to educate your way out of the biases if you can, or at least address the biases. And you have to ensure that it's not just like DE&I cannot be an HR topic. DE&I has to be a business topic. And it cannot be the cliche. When I joined Inovalon, I have to say, I was like, why are you asking me to run DE&I? I refuse, right? I need a white guy at the table. And while I was being somewhat facetious, the problem is if it becomes, the female CPO runs the DE&I, then it's not really embedded into how the business is thinking. And that's where we got to get to. So I probably didn't address all your questions, but I'm going to let someone else speak to that because that's a rich topic.
But the data point's a really important one because I think a lot of organizations are being, shall I say, distracted because they can't get to the data. Once you get to the data, then you can actually start to understand, am I asking the right questions? I mean, fundamentally, that's part of the problem is, I saw one of the items in the Q&A was about setting targets and meeting quotas. I would argue, are you actually asking the right questions when you set targets? Like I made the reference to how many URMs do you have at the senior most level of your organization? We would argue that that's the wrong question. How many underrepresented minorities do you have in the most influential positions, regardless of the seniority rank of the roles, is a better question. Are there certain areas of progression where you're starting to see challenges with respect to retaining underrepresented minorities? And why? Do you not have the right sponsorship for individuals, Black professionals, Latinx, to ensure that they get the same opportunities as others? So data's good. You have to get data and insight. But once you get it, then you can start to look at that and say, am I actually asking and or answering the right questions? So Ingrid, I just wanted to play off of the data point. I don't know, Yvette, if you've got anything else to share.
I co-sign. I would only add that, just like wax on, wax off the Karate Kid. So I'm telling my generation, the purpose of the data is not just to satisfy attaining that number. It is to get the leadership and organization all pulling all oars in the same direction, that it's attainable and it's a metric that's articulated in a way that gets people motivated and has some tangible. But this notion of there's a certain level of equilibrium that in the organization that's ideal. And so we're going to pull towards that. And once we get to that number, it's going to get great. Because I could tell you, having been a CEO, having been in the C-suite, all of these issues that we talk about don't go away with the ascension. It gets even lonelier. I mean, those roles are lonely anyway. I've been a part of initiatives where the ask has been, Yvette, you'd be the perfect mentor. So I have 72 mentees that I'm supposed to counsel every other week. It's just not sustainable. Yeah. But yes.
And Ken, you asked a question that I'm not too sure. We've been focusing a lot on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I think you asked a question which maybe was rooted in one of the questions from our participants around, how do you continue to care for the individual when organizations need to make really difficult decisions like reductions? Mm-hmm. I mean, a couple of things come to mind that we're seeing. Number one is going back to being a socially responsible organization. I've seen some companies take a greater level of investment around helping to make people more employable, even if they are individuals that they're either exiting from their organization or candidates that unfortunately they feel weren't a fit for their company. I'll give you an example. There's a financial services organization that happens to hire a high volume of individuals within their consumer bank, consumer banking space. And one of the things that they do for individuals that aren't hired is that they actually surface, using some technology, they surface like opportunities even at their competitor and offer opportunities to help train these candidates and applicants to be more employable. Some people invest as they are making tough decisions around exiting workers. They invest in training, reskilling of these individuals for the next hot skill that may be coming, so that they can land these individuals that they have to exit. They're not just giving them job placement, they're actually reskilling and upskilling them to make them more successful in the next career that they take. These are types of things that organizations, two things. Number one, if they really want to follow through on that promise of being a socially responsible organization. And then secondly, which is a little self-serving of the bottom line, organizations are realizing that the employee experience and the customer experience are really very intertwined. And so if I take an individual, a candidate that wasn't given a job, and I leave them with a really, really good experience, that they're more likely to become a customer or stay a customer. So there's, I don't want to just leave people with the focus that social responsibility is the only avenue. There's also a realization that a great experience for a worker or a candidate translates into a good opportunity to retain them or attract them as a customer.
Kraig, sounds right on the brand impact that all of this is having, hence our interest in this, right? Because a strong brand requires building those relationships with all stakeholders, internal and external, and they are intertwined now in our world. I think one of the interesting things out of all of this is that we're getting at, but haven't exactly dialed into, which may be a good switching thought process, which is the overall cultural change that HR is actually implementing in that employee experience and in what leaders want and what leaders see, with this new experience that employees have been kind of calling for a bit, but of course, which the last 12 months have exacerbated intensely with all of us right on this call and in our work, seeing each other's homes and living rooms and families in these new ways, and tied into inclusivity, tied into the crisis moment and change in work expectations. So how do you guys feel that the HR role is pushing better leadership and overall needs and that cultural feeling around organizations? Maybe Yvette, we can start with you.
From my chair, it's interesting. I used to listen to the HR function, fear for thinking about itself as the soft stuff in the organization. And the evolution of that today, especially in the difficult times that we've been in, has been, HR being the heart and the conscience of the organization in a time where, its warts and its communities, internal and external, are laid bare. And everybody is you have a higher proportion of people that have the posture of, to your point about, the Zoom meetings and the intimacy of home, those are boundaries that aren't traditionally crossed. There's something humanizing about the CEO whose son comes running in the room, but I also think the conversations that are coming to HR practitioners, ones of where there's leaders that are still, as we all are, still in formation around these ideas, and yet timid because they're worried about not showing up well as a leader in the moment. And so the types of conversations, what you work out at work, all of that. And you see a lot of this reflected in organizations working on competencies named empathy, purposeful leadership. I mean, if we were back in the 90s, it would sound like some far out trippy experiment, but it's kind of like the organization realizing that it needs to, and it's always been difficult for people leading results through people. Everything falls apart in the middle of the organization. And so I think there's an appreciation now for the art and the science of managing people, and how it's not a soft, skill, 1 and 1 never equals 2 with people, but there is, and giving the HR practitioner the confidence to say, hey, you look at the employee resource survey, and I know that it's telling us what we want to know, but that tool is not going to get us to the same insight if we would just ask our people to tell stories about their experience, and doing narrative analysis and really, so not just preaching to the HR folks about, you need to know more data, but giving them the confidence to map and to exercise the data that they know exists, and spend less time making a business case and more time just executing.
Well, there's an opportunity. We oftentimes talk, is there an opportunity for HR to lead from the front? And sometimes the answer is absolutely yes. There are there's things that HR can do to themselves to then be almost a little bit of a proof point around how to shift the culture, and then take some of those proof points and bring them more broadly across the enterprise. There was a comment, and I think in one of either the chat or the QA around, how do we bring the global view into this? And I think in the global view, there are a lot of regulations that are much more stringent than sometimes we have to face here within the US. And it's even more incumbent in those environments that HR needs to help really adjust the culture and the thinking of leaders. And a good example that I thought was interesting, if this goes back, I think, to 2017, in France, there was a law called the right to disconnect, which basically said, and I think it was just France, it may have been broader, which said—
It's a Sarkozy, yeah.
Yes, right. When an individual is out on leave, you can't email them, you can't connect with them at any point. So, one thing HR could do is really help ensure leaders are supporting and advocating for that law, because, by the way, if you don't, then you're out of compliance and at risk of repercussions. But as humans, we're also inclined to find the ways around it. And we have to really, as an HR organization, think, well, hey, can we actually redesign the way in which we do work so that we're not at risk of finding ways around some of these compliance and regulatory rules, but actually what we're doing is changing the way in which work gets done so that people don't find a way, oh, no, I know they're on vacation, but don't worry, I'm going to send an email anyway. Hey, how about, and I think this is a couple organizations have done this. I'd be interested in Ingrid's view from a technology perspective. Actually, there are ways in which technology can reply instantly back to an email saying, I am out, block the email. The email doesn't even come through to the individual's inbox. It reverts it so that you don't even have the tendency as a leader or as an employee to go, I know I shouldn't be following up on this, but I'm going to. So I think HR has got an opportunity to A, take the lead, and B, change the culture and the working norms to ensure that you're compliant and that you're focused in on the well-being of your workforce.
Any thoughts, Ingrid, just on your sort of direct experience of where you've seen sort of your role over the last year doing exactly, I mean, I think both so we got Kraig slid into another interesting question. One, which is where's this culture change? How are you seeing HR be more involved or influencing that? And then also you are an international firm. So where are you seeing, is there something about that international presence that you're seeing as challenging or an opportunity?
Well, what came to mind, several things actually, but what came to mind for me was that, the difference between here and Europe, there's still that, I think it actually goes back to a very Puritan mindset around the number of hours you work and always being available. And particularly in the past year with the pandemic, there has been this phenomenon that I think of as hyper productivity. You're always on, because there's not even that natural break where you either travel from the office to home or from home to the office, or you have to pick up the kids, or you have to get your dry cleaning. None of that exists in the current world. And so people are hyper productive. Like the opposite. I think some leaderships were worried that they would lose productivity from people as we went into a work from home situation. But I fear the opposite has actually happened, and people are, verging on some type of burnout much more widely because you can never get away. And we, I think, discussed as a group recently how to put wellness at the center of work. And I think we have a long way to go, because it is still, from my perspective, and maybe it's different in different parts of the country, and I'd love to hear someone else's experience. Maybe Yvette knows something I don't, or Kraig, but certainly, East Coast technology company, it's still a big focus on turn up, be present, and, sure you have the day off. I'm just going to text you anyway. I'm just going to email you anyway. Can you get on a call? The weekend, Sunday morning, let's chat, we have time. And that has not shifted. Having said that, so that is sort of like the core of work culture, what I think of as sort of like the underlying foundation of the work culture here. I think there's a lot to do to shift it more towards the, my personal background is Scandinavian. The Scandinavian model is much more around you can be very productive and not necessarily work 12 hours a day and the weekend. You mentioned France, the laws in France driving towards that. That is, I think there's a ways to go here to shift that, view of productivity. Maybe I'll pause there to give someone else a moment to speak. I was going to say something about like the momentum, the crisis of the past year, both from the social events and from the pandemic perspective, I think has given momentum to some of the niche issues, some of the, really particular engagement issues, some of the D&I issues that we've already covered. Sometimes a crisis, not sometimes, rarely does meaningful change occur without a crisis to kind of like jolt it forward. And I saw that jolt for us as a company, and I think that is widely true. I'll pause there.
It's funny, we sort of jumped right in to a lot of the impacts without actually starting with what has this sort of year of crisis done, et cetera, which I think is great, because I don't know that we needed to belabor that so much as jump right into the details. I'd say my follow-up maybe for Kraig and Yvette, based on what you just brought up, Ingrid, was, how do you keep the momentum going, right? Because we've often seen that. The crisis moment creates it, and then you kind of get right back into an equilibrium line where you don't keep pushing up from that moment that you had to in the crisis. So anyone, maybe Yvette, I see you nodding a lot, so you can maybe take the start on, how do we not waste the crisis longer term?
I think it's a brilliant question, and one that I know many people have been mindfully making the tactical decisions, but with a deference for longer term sustainable changes. And some of those changes are being driven by policies that are being in place. If you're close to policies at your workplace, the executive orders, you had a bit of big backlash between, if you're a federal contractor and you had one administration through an executive order prohibited activities with regards to inclusivity or diversity in the workplace. And then you had to, and along with a whole bunch of other platforms like immigration and visas processing, and so there's regulatory bumpers that drive and help return to normalcy. And then it's the companies that I see with more resilience and are doing that better are taking a systemic look at these issues and programs and practices and in a way that's not transactional nor linear. But I do think that it's just human nature that when you're, like you say, in crisis mode for a while, you want to kind of default to what was a prior comfortable state. But now how do we do that when we realize that wasn't a comfortable state for everyone? So it's just, and us finding our way collectively and individually in that process.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it starts with a fundamental realization, which is one of disruption is the new norm, right? If we all think we're going to make it, we're going to come out the other end of this pandemic and the biggest disruption, the biggest crisis we've ever seen is behind us, and thank goodness we're not going to have another one of those for 100 years. That's the wrong thinking. Some people will say the climate crisis is the next one that's going to hit us. And so I think, Matt, to answer your question, to play off of what Yvette said, you have to start with the realization that this world of perpetual disruption is the new norm. That's number one. Number two is then you look at the biggest disruption that we've had in a while and say, which Ingrid and Yvette and others have looked at and said, well, what has made organizations more successful than they thought they were? Resilience of the worker. All right. So then how do we bottle that? You have to look at things like, of course, the ability to work successfully in a virtual environment. That's not going to go away. People aren't going to say, oh, thank you, I'd like to now revert back to being in the office for 60 hours a week. The second thing you have to look at is a realization that your ability to quickly move people around your organization was what made people successful. Ford Motor Company pulled people off of the assembly line of making cars and had in the blink of an eye, had them go build respirators. So the resilience of the worker is going to be really key. And how do I effectively move them around? I saw a question then around upskilling. What's the business case for upskilling? Right? The business case for upskilling is the next time a disruption hits and you need to more effectively go and source people into the most critical area of your organization and navigate the disruption. One of the biggest ways to successfully do that is to quickly upskill folks. So I think a lot of people are going to look at this and say, gosh, unfortunately, this is the new norm. And so we can't go back. If we go back to the way we were, we're going to be obsolete.
Let me pick up on that theme of obsolescence and technology and start ask you a question, ask you there's a group of questions about technology change and what tools are being developed that will help HR manage some of these transitions. Can I start with you, Ingrid? I mean, you've talked about the importance of data, so data needs tools. I mean, what kind of tools do you see that are important for your work now and being developed that help HR achieve its both business and cultural issues better in the future?
So I'm just going to start with a micro area, which is engagement, right? So we all probably remember back to a time when the annual employee survey, so-called, was, many people took, at least an hour to fill out the questions. It took an incredible amount of time to analyze those. You get the answers back, you'd forgotten you'd ever taken a survey, et cetera, et cetera. So that is one area where having nimble platforms for engaging with your employees, being able to do quick surveys, check in with them. How do you feel, do you have everything you need, sort of thing, particularly around the pandemic where people are suddenly all working from home. What else do you need from us? Are you getting what you need? Do you need help? And not have it be a self-serving survey for the company, but really be a true engagement has helped. It's moved us forward tremendously to have a super nimble platform that also, by the way, I think is more what the born digital generations are used to. A quick way to engage, fewer questions, they're calling it pulsing now, right? Instead of surveying. So, do a quick pulse of where your employees are. So that's one area. Another area is how to engage with candidates. Having really nimble platforms that also, by the way, can address maybe potentially some of your biases. So you get much less detailed information about people's address or age or whatever it might be, and you just get really what you need, and you have much more nimble engagement with your candidates is another area where technology can really help. I think those are two examples that we recently deployed, and there are many more, but I'd love to hear from Kraig and Yvette.
Well, look, you have to do nothing but look at the market over the last couple of weeks / month and what big acquisitions or announcements have come out. Salesforce acquired Slack. By the way, that wasn't a coincidence. All right, they did that because they looked and they said, hey, we have this really great engagement layer, our Salesforce solution, but we don't have enough around collaboration and just-in-time learning. So they acquired Slack. They're going to bring those two together. You had, I think it was the end of last week, Microsoft announced their platform called Viva, which is a combination of Microsoft Teams and their Microsoft 365 platform. You've got ServiceNow and Bill McDermott out there talking about how ServiceNow is a work platform. So, from an HR perspective, I think we all spent a lot of time trying to solve for a better experience for when our workforce interacted with technology. We put a layer above the different various technologies we had to try and unify that experience. And by the way, that's all fantastic. But HR now needs to leverage technology sort of along the lines of what Ingrid is mentioning to make work easier. How do we have the right experience? How do we better enable collaboration across the entire organization or even externally with our ecosystem partners? How do I ensure just-in-time learning? Like, I'm not a very handy person, but if I need to go change a faucet, I just go on YouTube and I watch a video and then I can change a faucet. How do I have a wiki type model where if I have that experience, I can post it and I can put it out there. And if somebody's trying to do that, they can reach out directly to me within the organization. So you've got this knowledge share. You bring all that stuff together. That's where HR and HR technology needs to now start to play.
Beth, do you want to pick up on that?
I would just add that in addition to the toys, I mean, I've made at IBM, I service external companies around their human capital management needs. And I can say that, when you think about it, HR as a component of the organization, how many organizations have top talent for their HR employees? How many of them go to training? How many of them were invited to that strategy discussion where you were talking about opening or acquiring a business in a new geography and they could have told you there's no talent there? So part of the problem is, and even when there's implementation of digital workforce initiatives, sometimes it can often be a turf war between IT or the CFO that's paying for it. And you can understand why there's a crisis of confidence. So you can't suddenly have this HR professional that can't get your calendar time, that you've sidelined, not invested in, and when they've said, cry uncle, we can't turn all this data as fast as you can, and they're sent back to make business cases to parrot the language of finance as opposed to telling the story of the workforce and the people. You can give them all the tools and tricks and trades possible, but if there's not this wholesale recognition that if we want the Lamborghini of a workforce, then we're going to have more than a Pinto for an HR function. It has to not be looked at as sunk costs, and people can't be as capital looked at on the ledger as just what it costs on a profit and loss statement. So I just wanted to say, yes, I would love to see HR have better tools, but I would like to see them be able to be digitally proficient and articulate with even what's at their disposal today, and have confidence to push back on leaders to say, I don't think that's the right question, or the data that you're asking me to get won't get you to where you're trying to go, and do that with confidence.
So that you've used a couple metaphors. You just referred to the Pinto, which speak to me, being 57 years old. But one of the things about technology is technology skills aren't evenly distributed among employees or employee pools. Some people have less access to broadband or technology, harder to Zoom. Some may be older, and there may be some uneven distribution of technology knowledge. That's pretty critical in terms of the workplace. How does HR think about sort of that learning environment, that leveling up environment, that reskilling environment? What's the best practices there?
I think that from the predominant theme that I hear from HR people, a combination of, we knew what we knew. This was predictable. When we saw the demographic changes, we knew that all the tweaking around the edges of our comp and benefit or total rewards programs, we're going to change, and they were going to change big because we're going to have 5 generations in the workforce during a time where healthcare is going through. So they did all the Monte Carlo simulations, but that often in organizations, there's a short term, whether it's every quarter or every period, there's an orientation there. And I think that the professionals that are equipped and ready are not only talking about the tools, but they're talking about reimagining how problems and opportunities are defined, and having a point of view from the top of the house through cascading it through the organization, how they are going to have visibility. Because, when you talk about learning, 80% of it is on the job training. And that extra 20%, that's differentiator, that's strategic capability building stuff that allows teams to do what Kraig was saying with regards to being agile. That in order for HR to plug and play there, they've got to have visibility of the people, the on-the-job environment, and a trusted partnership.
So Ingrid, we started talking at the very beginning, talking about HR department stepping up. And we spent a lot of time to talk about how HR teaches the rest of the company. Who teaches HR about this expanded mission? What are the responsibilities of leaders like yourself to train and upskill your team? I'm going to ask that because I think there are probably a lot of HR professionals in the audience thinking about, how do I learn? Where do I learn? What do I need to learn? I want to ask that of everyone. It's sort of a final closeout question, but starting with you, Ingrid.
I think it's a really excellent question. Usually people say that when they're not really sure what the answer is. So you
got a stall going. Good. I'll help you out here by endorsing that.
So I think, one of the trends that has happened, in the last few recent years is, for people to design their own learning, right? To have these, for example, LinkedIn Learning platform, where people can avail themselves of learning anytime and the learning that they feel they need. And there are, of course, many other elements to it, but that's certainly one that we use, which is, for the entire population, but also for HR. What I am searching for is I need more HR people who have broader business skills and that can, come to the table bringing their HR, the storytelling of the workforce and the things that Yvette is speaking to, but also come with business acumen and numbers literacy that allow them to have the conversation at that table. And to put HR in the broader context of how do what I bring to the table as the people function help the company differentiate itself, be more competitive, pull those little levers, right? Because every company is eking out every competitive edge it can, especially in technology. So let's not underplay marketing. Let's not underplay HR. Let's not underplay the areas that traditionally haven't been viewed as a differentiator. And to do that, we have to bring more than just the HR skills. We have to have the business skills within the HR function.
Kraig, what does HR have to learn?
Comments on that?
Yeah, thank you, Ingrid.
The end of Family Feud when you do the number one answer. Well, Ingrid stole the number one answer, so I won't repeat the business acumen. I think is absolutely critical. But the workforce view with a workforce centered mentality. I think a lot of HR folks, and I really don't mean this critically, but a lot of HR folks. Look, I've been in HR for 30 years. I know the programs that the worker wants. I know, the experience. Okay, but I'd say I'd rather you go ask the worker. Conduct focus groups. Break your workforce down into personas, so you really understand the generational differences and needs. What a new hire wants to experience versus a tenured individual. Tap into expertise and experience throughout your own organization. If you think about the onboarding process, not only go tap into newly onboarded individuals, but pull in IT, pull in real estate, pull in all the folks that touch the onboarding process and redesign through the lens of the worker, but also through the lens of all of the stakeholders that have a hand in creating the right experience. That would be the second answer I would provide.
All right, Kraig, thank you for playing the feud. Yvette,
hopefully that was
the number two answer.
Choice number two. I don't know.
All right, we've left the people's choice number 3 to you.
So I would say that HR really needs to keep their eye on the business of the business. So absolutely, we've seen how in the changing of the dynamics in the overall market, businesses are going back to business continuity, keeping the lights on, and trying to develop keep warm strategies to ramp up when they feel that the landscapes of talent is different. And I think HR is going to have to get that type of an ability to scale up, scale down, to look at the different sources and ways that talent is engaged. Not everyone is on the full-time ledger, and for them to constantly be clear about, if this is our given business strategy, what are the culture, organizations, leadership, and talent implications for them, for that, so that they are inextricably linked, so that when they're having conversations or coaching managers to have discussions that say, this person has potential, they can be depth at saying potential for what, and setting expectations that this agility with learning and constantly reimagining yourself is an ongoing competency in and of itself. And that would be, if I were in HR, I would get better at knowing the business of the business, so that when there's up and down turns or strategic opportunities, I can create pathways as opposed to asking how I can help.
Thank you, Yvette. Well, so I actually lied. My last question is actually from Matt Quint. So Matt, it's sort of our exit question. Not so long ago, I would not have thought of being HR as being central to a company's brand. How do you think that's changed in the last few years in terms of the importance of HR and company culture to the value of a brand? How do you see that changing in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it got addressed here. As I said, that internal-external balance is hugely important, and we've seen it affect from a talent management perspective, where especially younger professionals are eager to go, the kinds of things you see on surveys. I think that matching the attitudinal survey stuff, which says I'd rather work for a culture that fits me and sacrifice some salary. I don't know that we have the empirical behavioral evidence on that to be perfectly clear, but certainly on an anecdotal basis and what employers are now committing to, you are seeing that change. The employer brand to draw the talent in that will allow them to execute something that delights their other stakeholders is hugely important now. And how HR can play a role in crafting that culture, because of course HR doesn't create the culture. It's created by teams, it's created by leadership, it's created by the history of the company. So, where HR can help sort of steer that ship is going to continue to be extremely important. And of course, whatever happens internally in organizations in a world of social media gets out externally, right? Kraig was talking about the internal person maybe staying as a customer, but also that internal employee having a bad experience with an organization may spread the word about that organization that may change other people's decision, their friends and family's decision to be a customer, right? So that word of mouth influence that's expanded in social media technology environment continues to make HR and its role in culture really important.
Yeah, and Matt, think in the world of the gig worker, you got much more choice. So, the old world and W-2 workers or, contracted workers, your ability to go, nah, I don't want to. As a gig worker, you have choice. You have agency. You have choice. So even more important than ever.
Yeah, Kraig, you're bringing up one of the next hour of our webinar, right? I mean,
you're welcome.
Every one of these, I've had the other issue, right? Gig workers, what about the imbalance that we teased into a little with the example of, the technology company working in Harlem and such, and like the imbalances in different, in COVID and crisis, some organizations are doing quite well because they're high need, and others, entertainment industry, for example, right now is falling apart. And those are very different, right? So, the next hour of questions to come from this. So let me just end here instead, because we are at the end of our hour. And so let's give everyone a virtual round of applause. Kraig, Yvette, Ingrid, our panelists. Thank you, Ken, for co-moderating this with me. We're really excited for all of the participants to join. You are obviously now on our mailing list. You will hear about future events from ASCEND as well as the Brand Center around leadership and these changing values of leadership and changing needs, and how organizations ascend and DEI ascends in that. And also a reminder that we are recording this. So if you came in late, we will be sharing a link to the event post-production, and you can also share that with others who you think might be interested. So unless you have any final thoughts, Ken,
thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.